Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's GLF Live. I'm Gabrielle Lipton, the editor of Landscape News for the Global Landscapes Forum, and today we're going to discuss a bit of an emotional topic, but one that probably everyone here listening has experienced to either a small or large degree, and that is eco-anxiety. And I'd like to start by saying that this is a term that should not be taken lightly. As we'll dive into more in this discussion, eco-anxiety is not yet a medical diagnosis, but it is rapidly escalating as a mental health issue around the world, particularly for young people and for mothers, causing severe feelings of sadness, anger, and stress triggered by climate change-related events. And this affects the overall health of individuals. So today we have the privilege of hearing from one of the foremost psychologists studying eco-anxiety, Dr. Susan Clayton, who is a professor of psychology at the College of Wooster in Ohio, and she's currently tuning in from Paris. She's published numerous surveys and studies that have helped establish eco-anxiety in the public lexicon, and she's also a lead author on the forthcoming 6th assessment report of the IPCC. So perhaps she's among the most well-positioned individuals at the intersection of climate and psychological sciences. And we also have with us, hopefully joining soon, she's having a bit of a technical issue, but should be jumping in shortly, Ridhima Pandey, who's one of the most renowned youth climate activists. And at the age of 9, she filed a lawsuit against the Indian government for their lack of climate action. She's also spoken out against the UN for their inaction. And for her host of other activist work, she was in 2020 listed as one of the BBC's top 100 most empowering women. So we hope to have her in here soon. But in the meantime, Susan, welcome. It's such an honor to have you here today. And I'd like to start with a very basic question, which is about the wording that we use around eco-anxiety. It's also called climate change distress, climate anxiety, ecological grief. There are a lot of phrases being thrown around to describe the negative feelings that climate change is triggering in more and more people. Do you have a preference around any of this terminology and the language that we use?
Hi, Gabrielle. Thanks for focusing on this topic. I think the range of terms that we're seeing is a reflection of the range of emotions people are experiencing. So there are different ways in which we're responding emotionally to the climate crisis. I tend to use the term climate anxiety because I'm principally focused on climate change, but all of the terms I think are valid and reasonable ones. And some people feeling maybe predominantly anxiety, but others maybe it's more grief, maybe it's more anger in some cases. So I want everybody to feel that they can choose the term that best describes their experience.
Mm-hmm. And could you tell us a bit about your experience and your journey choosing to study this topic? What drove you to begin publishing and researching on climate anxiety?
Sure, and it's been kind of one of those things that I didn't anticipate the directions I was going to go in when I started. I'm trained as a social psychologist, not a clinical psychologist, so I primarily focus on social interactions. And as somebody who's interested in environmental issues very much, I started to think about basically how people talk to each other about climate change or don't talk to each other about it, how it might be affecting social interactions and kind of social well-being. And that began to edge into an awareness of mental health impacts, which I really started to look at almost 15 years ago. And the more I researched that, the more I realized that this was a phenomenon that was happening and that was probably growing. And we needed to do more to understand it and just to name it, because if we don't have a name for it, it's hard for it to have any political power or meaning for people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It is important to attach some terminology so everyone's on the same page and has a similar starting point for how we describe these feelings. You said that this started about 14, 15 years ago for you. How has the scientific community in your field joined forces and gathered around this topic? Is it still niche within the psychological field of sciences, or is it growing and gaining traction?
I would say both of those things are true, and it's actually been very validating and rewarding to see the psychological community begin to recognize that they have an important role to play in responding to climate change and other environmental challenges. Back in around the turn of the 21st century, I was asking psychologists essentially what did they think about environmental issues and the role of psychology. And some of them had very interesting responses. They said, yes, we should be paying more attention. But some of them said, this means nothing. Why would psychology have anything to do with environmental issues? That's silly. So we were really starting from a fairly low level there. And then within the first decade of this century, the American Psychological Association put together a task force to examine psychology and climate change. That there's a second iteration of that task force is currently working. And just there's really been an explosion of interest and awareness, not just by individual psychologists, but by psychological organizations. However, there's still a lot of people who are very unfamiliar with the idea that they're connected.
Mm-hmm. I would like to get back to where the science is going on this in just a moment. But while we wait for hopefully Ridhima to still join, perhaps you can touch on some topics related to young people. In the years when you were first beginning to look into this topic, you said that you were noticing this in people. You were noticing climate anxiety start to be a phenomenon, I think was the term that you used. Was there a certain demographic that you were witnessing this in, or what experiences did you have with people in the social sector that made you turn your attention to this?
Yeah, it wasn't really that I was personally encountering young people. And of course, young people often have less access to the media, and they're a little bit harder to do research on because you have to worry about issues of consent and parental approval and so on. So it really was, what did I happen to hear about? And mostly in the media, there would be reports of people describing themselves as having climate anxiety, but it tended to be adults. So it wasn't until a few years passed that I started to hear more buzz about, yes, children are very worried. And I think some specific events around the world may have drawn, well, certainly the rise of youth activism, I think has been important. Why are these youth so up in arms? Because they're emotionally responding to the climate crisis, but also events around the world, like I think the Australian wildfires of a few years ago, the response of children who lived in Australia, who of course were very aware of the smoke, and there were terrible images of animals that couldn't escape and so on. So I think that also drew our attention to the ways in which children and young people were responding.
Mm-hmm. And seeing this, seeing young people respond, seeing youth activists, take to the streets around this and experience things like smoke from a young age. As a social psychologist, what alarm bells did that sound for you in your mind, seeing such young people start to have these quite mature emotions founded actually in reality?
Well, this may be obvious, but experiences children have can sort of permanently alter the trajectory of their lives in a way that may be more true for than for adults, because young people are still forming their sense of who they are and what their capabilities are. So events that may traumatize them, or events that may lead them to question some basic assumptions about the future, impair their sense of security, those can have long-term impacts. So that was really my concern. It's of course it's sad when adults are affected and traumatized and emotionally overwrought or appropriately wrought. But for children, you just have a sense that it's affecting the entire trajectory of their lives in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard to hear that. I'd like to switch quickly back to the science that's happening around this, as you mentioned before. And you just published a major survey about the percentages of youth that are feeling worried, very worried, extremely worried about climate change. Yeah, over 60%, or about 60%, I think you found, were feeling very or extremely worried, which is a very high percentage across, I believe, 10 countries. What other research are scientists in your field doing? Yours was a survey. You've done a bunch of research on the literature and the term that we use to describe these feelings, but you said that more and more psychologists are gathering around this topic. What sorts of research is being done around this?
Yeah, it really is very new, as of course, when you start realizing this is something that deserves study, it can take a few years to develop your methods and get your data and so on. So people are, I want to say in some ways, rushing to find out more about what is the evidence for climate anxiety, what does that look like, and how does it relate to markers of mental health, but also people are very interested, obviously, in saying, well, how can an emotional response to climate change be coped with, be dealt with in a way that is not, is not debilitating for anyone, but especially for the young people. So what are good ways for people to cope with their emotional responses to climate change?
Mm-hmm. And what are some of those ways?
Well, a big debate right now has to do with, is it important to take action or not? And like so many things about people, it's very complicated. I would say in general, it is very useful to take action. And one reason is that one of the negative aspects of climate anxiety is your feeling of helplessness and powerlessness, and being just a passive victim to these unstoppable forces. So starting to take action can at least make you feel that you aren't passive, you're an agent. You have some control over what's going on. And of course, those experiences of taking action, whether that be trying to make your own home more sustainable, or working with a school group or a community group, or being politically active, if you actually have an impact, that's extremely validating. And beyond just making people feel powerful, it can also give their life a sense of meaning and purpose. And that's something that's very valuable to all of us. And I think something that people think is an important part of existence, to have a sense of meaning in your life. The reason I hesitate about that idea of taking action is that I think the last thing we want to do is to make people who are feeling anxious also feel guilty for not doing enough. And that's something that also happens. So to take action, but not to assume kind of sole responsibility for responding to and managing the climate crisis is also very important.
Mm-hmm. And what about taking action in terms of seeking help, seeking support? How does that manifest in a time when this isn't yet a medical diagnosis and it's still growing in the public discourse as a real idea? So what about, seeking help for people who are experiencing this extreme distress?
Absolutely. And I think I'm glad you said that, because people should focus not just on, they should recognize that it's legitimate not just to focus on the climate crisis, but on protecting their own health. And that certainly includes mental health. So it's not self-indulgent to try and cope with these somewhat overwhelming emotions. And that may include things like getting tips on how to cope with anxiety, how to step back and de-stress, how to be mindful, deep breathing techniques, things like that. So absolutely, I would encourage people who are feeling kind of overwhelmed by their emotions to look for help. Now, your question raises the problem of, well, this is not a diagnosis, this is not a specific recognized condition. How can you make sure your therapist is sympathetic? In other words, that they understand the problem and are not going to be dismissive. And I would like to think that very few therapists would dismiss the problem, but some of them certainly are less informed than others. So it is a good idea. I think there's increasing numbers of therapists who will talk about themselves as actively engaged with therapy for ecoanxiety, or as utilizing something you might call ecotherapy. So it is worth, I think, looking for a therapist who is going to recognize the scope of the problem, as opposed to saying, gee, I never really thought about it before.
So seeking out a practitioner who has some specialty in this topic. Absolutely. Just a quick update. I think Ridhima is going to be able to join us very soon. She's in the process of connecting via a different device. I'll also take this opportunity to ask anyone who's listening to feel free to ask some questions that come to mind as you're listening to this conversation. We'll leave some time for questions from the audience at the end. So if there's anything you would like to ask Dr. Clayton, please feel free to drop that in any of the chats that you're tuning in from. You're also, switching back to our conversation, you're a lead author on the IPCC report that's forthcoming, and it will be a huge report. Past IPCC reports have made a huge splash in the climate community and just in the general public, giving extreme warnings about where we stand in the climate crisis. What brought you into that authorship process, and what is your role within it?
Yeah, and let me give a little background for the listeners who may not be aware of this, that the IPCC report, it is very impactful. It includes authors from around the world, and very deliberately not just privileging Western authors who often are more likely to be featured. So very international, very much mindful about including North and South, very mindful about including reference to indigenous knowledge, but also very validated. So they're not expressing their opinions, they're reporting the results of peer-reviewed research. And so it's a very solid report, and as you can imagine, takes forever to produce. The other thing is it includes 3 components. The first, which was actually released, I think, a few weeks ago, is about the physical science basis. So what evidence do we have that climate change is happening, and what predictions can we make about what that will look like in terms of kind of physical processes and meteorological processes. The second part, which I'm involved in, is looking at the impacts on people. And then the third part, we'll start to talk about mitigation and what can we do to reduce the extent of climate change. So previous IPCC reports have made only very brief reference to mental health, but there was a deliberate choice or recognition that it needed to be included more in the current version, which should be released next spring after it's been vetted by governments. And so there are more psychologists involved, and essentially we're trying to, when we talk about human impacts, recognize the breadth of human impacts, that it's not just about physical health, and it's not just about economic well-being or patterns of habitation, but it's also including mental health and a broad definition of well-being.
And you're mentioning these other forms of health, physical health. It can certainly affect financial health, all sorts of health. But in terms of mental health in particular, how does that trickle down into other aspects of individuals' lives? And then broadening out from that, as more and more individuals are impacted negatively by these feelings, how does that affect a society? And yes, how does this mental health issue have large-scale effects?
Yeah, I think as not just as a single society, but as a global society, we do tend to be dismissive about mental health issues, as if people who have mental health problems just need to pull themselves together, and if they're feeling sad, well, that's kind of their problem. I think that we have an increasing recognition that first, that mental health is not just something that happens to individuals, but it's a result of at least in part, of social circumstances. And then also that it does impair other aspects of functioning. So that's really one of the definitional aspects of when something becomes a mental health issue is when it starts to interfere with your ability to live your life. Can you no longer work as productively? Can you no longer kind of be a well-functioning family member, or can you no longer enjoy socializing with your friends? So when your mental health is impaired, it definitely can impair your economic productivity. And certainly it's really almost impossible to disentangle physical health and mental health, because they very much influence each other. And at some level, like a sleeping problem, is that a mental health problem? Is that a physical health problem? It's really both. Mental health problems can impair the functioning of your immune system, so make you more susceptible to physical diseases. So mental health can have a huge impact on the way we function as a society. I mean, just imagine a society in which everybody is depressed. It's not going to be a very, high-functioning society.
Mm-hmm. Going back to something we discussed earlier, but I'd like to dig into a bit deeper, is the fact that this is not yet a medical diagnosis, which, considering it's still quite new in the public discourse and in the scientific discourse as well, I guess is not a surprise. But what is the pathway to getting it to be a medical diagnosis? And what are the benefits of getting it registered in some of the major literature, the resources, the guidebooks, having it registered there as a medical diagnosis?
Well, I would say it's not necessarily clear that it should be registered as a separate diagnosis. And I say that for two reasons. One is that having it be a diagnosis risks making it seem like a problem of the individual that needs to be cured, rather than a problem of the society that needs to be addressed. So I like to think that climate anxiety can be a signal to societies and to governments that we need to be doing something about this. The other aspect is there something different from a psychological point of view about climate anxiety than about other sources of anxiety? And maybe there are, and that's what we will, hopefully discover more about. And if there are important differences, then maybe it should be a separate diagnosis. But otherwise, it could be just treated. People get anxious about a lot of things, and they can seek help for their anxiety. So I think for now, that's a reasonable way to go.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for making that distinction. And then in terms of how this continues to be escalated as an issue, there have been talks about it becoming an issue of human rights at a national or international level. Is there any precedent for how government should address a mental health crisis like this? Or what sort of political action would you like to see taken?
Yeah, I'm not a legal scholar, but my sense is there probably is not a precedent. And one reason for that is what I was just saying, that people have tended to not take mental health very seriously, and certainly not considered it something that needs to be addressed at a societal level for the most part. So the idea of societies acting to protect mental health, my guess is fairly new, but it would be a great thing. And we do have increasing awareness. I think in some ways, governments have more recognition of the ways in which they can protect the well-being of their citizens. So, and we have an increased sense of human rights, essentially, that we have the right not just to kind of be left alone, but the right to schooling, and the right maybe to some level of medical care, and the right to some level of access to food and water. And so expanding that to say, yes, and we have the right to mental health, and we have the right to healthy environments. That's certainly something that seems to be happening around the world. So I hope that it's a powerful message that governments will think about responding to this idea that people have a right to a future. I mean, this is what it boils down to. Children, young people have a right to a future that is not, and current generations do not have the right to, live their life at the expense of the future of young people. I don't want to be one of those people who says, that humanity is going to be wiped out within 2 decades, because I don't think so. But on the path we're on, standards of living are going to be degraded by climate change in order to maintain the standard of living of the current generations. And that just seems morally wrong.
Mm-hmm. And even that very idea is triggering, especially as a young person, and you're thinking about starting a career, starting investing, and you don't feel sure-footed that there's going to be a safe foundation environmentally for you to do so. And so that imagined future can also be very triggering for these feelings.
Exactly. We were talking about the effects of mental health. If people feel that the future is frightening, and the study you were just referring to, we found, 3/4 of respondents said the future was frightening. That's going to affect the long-term decisions you make. You might be less likely to plan for the future, so you're not saving. You may be making decisions about whether or not to have children. You may not feel that it's worth it to put effort into a long-term career plan. So I hope that there aren't, I don't want young people to be feeling like that, but if you really feel pessimistic about the future, that's a reasonable response.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to turn our attention a bit to what listeners are chiming in with. We have a question, but also one of our listeners, Alexi, has posted a quote, which some of us might have heard before, but it's a powerful quote. And perhaps you could just respond to this from a psychological point of view. It's from Greta Thunberg. And I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day, and then I want you to act. Could you just respond to that?
It's a very powerful quote, and I think definitely the reason that Greta Thunberg has been so influential is because of the clarity of her emotional response. That she is she's afraid and she's angry, and so it's a very strong emotion, a very empowering emotion. As applied to other people more generally, panic is not usually a good response, because panic tends to, when your emotions are too strong, it's hard to make good decisions. There's a physiological influence of that emotional state, and your thoughts may be less clear, and you may have a harder time recognizing alternative possibilities or alternative points of view. So I think her call is important to listen to, and an important challenge to all of us to recognize that their emotions are an important signal. Hey, something important's going on. Stop and pay attention. Stop and do something. But I don't think panic is a good daily state for anybody to exist in.
Mm-hmm. It will have lasting impacts on your nervous system, I can imagine.
I can, yes.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from our listener, Katia. Are you aware of any work on introducing this or other emotional education into schools and curriculums?
Yeah, great question. I've actually been giving some thought to that. There, a lot of people, such as parents, such as teachers, are asking, well, what do we need? What should we be telling our children? Do we have to worry about scaring them at a very early age? Should we try and tell them everything's okay, or how can we prepare them to deal with this crisis? So I don't have specific examples in mind, but I know that there are people working on sort of developing curricula to help students grasp the reality. I would say a couple of important principles. One is not to lie to children, but with very young children, there's something to be said for not giving them the whole truth. It's like you don't say to a 3-year-old, mommy and daddy are going to die someday, even though they are. The 3-year-old should think their parents are going to live forever. Children need to feel secure and stable, and so we want to encourage them. But they're also, from a fairly young age, they're getting some messages about environmental crises from their friends and their older siblings and and the media. So to tell them, no, that's wrong, don't pay any attention to that, is going to give them the sense that they can't whoever tells them not to pay attention is not a reliable source, so they'll lose their trust in that person. So giving them accurate information, but just in the right doses, is very important. And then to give them, it's important for them too to feel a sense of hope. And hope doesn't mean blind optimism that, oh, things will work out. It means there is a possibility that things will work out. And we were talking about agency earlier, and even very young children can be given an opportunity to have some agency. Whether it be, you can be responsible for going around and turning the lights off at home, make sure we don't leave lights on, or, you can be responsible for helping with the recycling. And slightly older children could work with their school or work with their community, or even start writing politicians. As we know from Ridhima, you said, was already filing a lawsuit at age 9.
Mm-hmm. I liked what you said about a possibility that things might work out. That's a bit bittersweet, but I suppose a realistic and tinged with hope approach to this.
Exactly. I read that somewhere, and I'm afraid I don't remember whose quote it was, but that hope is not about thinking that things will be okay, but it's about maintaining the idea that there's a possibility that things will be okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Keeping your feet on the ground as you hope as well. Something that I was hoping that Ridhima was going to be able to speak to us about, but it seems she's still having technical difficulties. And Ridhima, if you're listening, I'm so sorry. But is about parts of the world where mental health is still stigmatized, and maybe mental health issues as a whole are not quite accepted as real issues or discussed, and particularly among young people. What are some solutions to this, and what can be done in these parts of the world?
Well, that's a good question. I think increased education is part of it. I think one thing that I hope has made a difference, although I haven't seen any statistics about it, I think the COVID pandemic may have given people a slightly different perspective on mental health, because everybody can recognize that this was a huge stress, that the pandemic, the lockdown, the deaths contributed to mental health problems. So it's a reminder that individual mental health, as we were saying earlier, is affected by social circumstances. And so it's not something that individuals should feel, reflects badly on them. And I think governments have also, or at least, some governments have been aware or made aware of the need to devote resources to mental health because of COVID-19. So I like to think that's been a step in the direction of greater legitimacy towards the idea that mental health, again, it's not the fault of the individual, and that societies can help to protect mental health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think everyone has experienced some form of mental health in this pandemic. I think we can all relate to that. Also, in terms of current events, our listener Jules is asking, will you or others be sharing the results of your survey findings at the COP? This could be very useful to focus minds. And I will broaden that question a bit to ask, what do you hope to see happen with climate anxiety and mental health at the COP? What discussions would you like to see had there in that setting?
Yes, well, I don't have any formal roles there. There's a side event on mental health and climate change that's been organized in collaboration with the Glasgow City Council. So that will be a completely virtual event. So hopefully that will allow the topic to be prioritized. Several things that have happened this fall are happening, including the study about young people that you described earlier. We really had a goal of releasing those into the public domain before COP so that it can become part of the discussion. And we are very happy that the UN Secretary General made reference to the findings of that study. So it has entered political discussion. Whether it actually makes a difference, who knows? But again, I think the reasons that climate anxiety is so important is that it can affect all of us. So, people who, there are countries that are experiencing wildfires, and there are countries that aren't. There are countries that are experiencing droughts and countries that aren't, or storms, but all of us can experience this climate anxiety. So being aware of it hopefully will be an additional source of motivation for governments and NGOs to come up with some specific plans. And that's, in a very broad sense, what I really hope for from COP26 is that I'm not a policy expert. I can't say what policies will necessarily be the best to address the problem, but just a sense that people are trying to address the problem. They are making policy proposals that have at least a plausible chance of being effective. I think that would be very good for mental health, for people to see that governments were taking action.
Mm-hmm. I think that links well to what you were saying about the possibility of hope. And if there's some possibility that governments are taking action, then that definitely can ignite a sense of change, possible change. I know we've been speaking for quite a while, so I'd like to close out here. It's unfortunate that Ridhima hasn't been able to join. Again, I'm so sorry, Ridhima, if you're listening. But we've had a wonderful audience and some great discussions happening in the chat as well. So I think it's been a very fruitful conversation. And I'm wondering if we could end, Susan, with you just giving a few messages to our wonderful audience who's joined us today, which I believe is of all ages, from young people to young professionals to adults and parents. I don't know if you have targeted messages for the different demographics or if there are some main messages you'd like to convey, but when people are wrapping their heads around these feelings and the future of climate change and where our environment is headed, what would you like to tell them?
I think the first thing I would like to say is thank you and congratulations, because everybody who's been listening today is facing up to this challenge and trying to learn about it and trying to do what they can rather than hiding their head in the sand, and definitely deserve congratulations for that, and thanks from all of us. The second message is just to reiterate what I said before. Don't feel that the responsibility lies on your shoulders alone as an individual. No one person caused climate change, and no one person is going to fix it. But it's astonishing how much power, nevertheless, each of us has, not just through our own individual actions, but through our voices, which are able to influence so many other people. And then the third thing is, here's one of the things that keeps me going. I think that we should be aiming not just to avoid the worst of the problem. I think we should think of this as an opportunity to reimagine society in a way that is better than it was 10 years ago. I think most of us can recognize that there's a whole lot of other problems in the world besides climate change. There's vast levels of inequality, there's disease, there's prejudice, and people are leading lives. Many people are leading lives that do not provide them with a source of meaning or joy. So reimagining some of the basic ways in which we go about living can help to address climate change, but can also address some of these other problems. And so I'm optimistic that in a few decades, society will actually be better.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for ending on that positive message. I think that's a nice one to carry us through our day and our week and the COP. And thank you so much for joining us. It was such a privilege to hear from you. And we will look forward to your forthcoming research and the forthcoming IPCC report to see how this is all woven in. It's nice to know that the mental health sector is heading in this direction and taking this seriously. So thank you so much for speaking. And to everyone listening, we will see you next time on GLF Live. We have another conversation tomorrow about carbon markets, quite a different topic. But please join back if you're interested in learning about carbon trading and how that's going to be discussed at the COP this year. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Clayton. And we'll see you next time on GLF Live.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.